The vast majority of media professionals rely heavily on the cloud for media storage, but unfortunately, digital storage, including cloud, was never designed with long-term preservation in mind. Believe it or not, folks, I've had that happen. I've had the pain of hard disks just, suddenly not working anymore. And then, oh my goodness, there's tears before bedtime, I can tell you that. So there are actually multiple ways in which digital storage methods can fail. And archivists, those that are responsible for the long-term safekeeping of media, are very aware that they need ways to solve these issues or work around them. Now, our next speaker, who joins us with a magnificent dinosaur head behind him there, which is just wonderful, he is the VP of Technology for IMES, and we're going to have a discussion based around his recent white paper published with the Archive Working Group of the Entertainment Technology Center at the University of Southern California. And we're going to learn what approach and adjustments should be made to ensure cloud storage and technology are a safe and long-term archival solution. So let me just tell you a little bit about our wonderful guest. He's got over 25 years of experience working for Iron Mountain, NASA, Disney, Sony, and several post-production facilities, designing and deploying database and media handling systems and large-scale, high-performance computing and storage architectures. He has got over 15 years experience in post-production and digital media and data lifecycle management. At Iron Mountain Entertainment Services, I'm going to call that IMES from now on, he oversees all technology issues with over several facilities that cover North America and Europe, as well as many special projects dealing with media and data preservation and restoration. Denis has won an Academy Award for scientific and engineering achievement in the field of film preservation. Denis, it's a real honor to have you join us at the conference. Welcome to our virtual stage.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. So I think maybe we could start the discussion by talking about why it's so important to talk about archiving and preservation, but with long-term thinking and a long-term mindset. I know this is very much the mindset that you have. So maybe you'd like to kick things off and tell us why exactly that's so important.
It's very important because it kind of goes against the grain of essentially the way civilization is going right now. Cultural preservation is really important. And of course, this is something that is not always something we think about all the time. And also from a commercial aspect, we need to keep in mind the fact that the long tail is a thing. To give you an example, there is still a lot of interest in black and white films. The silent films, and a lot of those unfortunately are gone. They weren't preserved properly. They were nitrate film. They're gone. You can find Buster Keaton movies on YouTube, for example. They're still monetizable. Unfortunately, the problem is that the current society, civilization thinking has accelerated over time, and it's really at a frantic pace right now. And we are really, really focused on the now, not even the moment, but the focus on the now. And it's because there's this very active, I won't say frantic because it's a good thing. There is this cycle of content creation that is consumed, and then we move on to the next thing. And this is what all of our devices and society is kind of geared towards. This is the essential focus. The creative process is very now oriented. So corporations have horizons that vary from the quarter to, the multi-year planning, which is 3 to 5 years. That's very short. The tools are evolving constantly for increased ease and capabilities in production, but there is not a whole lot of thinking as to what's going to happen after they become obsolete. And so, and in the middle of that, we need to think about preservation is something that requires thinking over the centuries, at least more than your generation. It's something that is inherently difficult. People typically don't think about what's going to happen in 100 years. It's really difficult to conceptualize. So on top of that, what's interesting is that something very peculiar happened about 150 years ago. I guess the wax cylinders was it. This was the first time that humanity kind of stepped away from an information recording method that was essentially human readable directly. Until then, it was, papers, it was writing, it was drawings, it was sculptures, it was objects that were, it was actually mostly optical media, by the way, all of that. And all of a sudden, we got into information recording methodologies that used machines. And it went on from there. It got more and more complicated, more and more depending on machinery. And what's interesting, and I don't think we got over that quite yet as a civilization, because there was not a whole lot of thinking that was put into preserving the machines, preserving the whole tool chain, as opposed to just the recording. It's all well and good to preserve the recording, but if you don't have anything to read it with, well, it's as if it didn't exist. It's as if it was lost. This is something we deal with every day, actually, at IMES, by scrounging on eBay for old machines. And the problem is that there's a dwindling amount of available devices to read these old recordings, which is actually very worrisome, because some of them, which may be really crucial, won't be read just for the lack of equipment to read them. It's very difficult to recreate that equipment. And so that's really a quandary. So essentially, we really live in a society that is really designed with rather short term, a few years, maybe a generation type of thinking when it comes to media production, and long-term preservation, which is truly important just for a civilization continuity standpoint, and also as a commercial incentive, is not always part of the picture. And it's kind of like the eternal struggle of the archivist to make sure that, hey, this matters. You really need to think about it.
Yeah, totally. And, there's technologies that kind of go out of fashion. There's companies that go under. I read recently with horror about that company that does bionic retinas or something like this.
Right.
And basically the company went bust. And so these physical implants are no longer going to be supported in the market. And folks who have them installed are, there's a big question mark about what happens if they break down. And, like you say, we have this kind of fast turnover mentality. It used to be when a major architectural was planned like a cathedral, the architect would not see it being built. He wouldn't see it being launched, like the Sagrada Familia here in Barcelona. But, we need to have that long-term thinking, because we're talking about, the cultural artifacts of humanity. It's super important. But, we all live in this digital world now. And I, mistakenly, I always had the feeling that once I saved my stuff on digital storage, that's fine. Everything's going to be all right, and that's just going to last forever. But talk to us a bit about why this is not actually the case. Why does digital storage fail?
Well, that's a really good question. The issue with that is basically all storage will eventually fail, and that's been the plight of archivists since the beginning of time. And digital has additional problems that it has more of a stack of potential failures that make it potentially more vulnerable to a multitude of failure modes. When you have analog recording, to start with that, essentially when you read an analog recording, you are sampling a signal. Analog recording is just that, it's signal. You sample it, you create something new every time, and you have better avenues to potentially fix problems because it doesn't have compression, for example, in terms of data compression. So you can always try and fix it because there is a lot of redundant data. And it degrades more gracefully, so to speak. And when it comes to digital, there is a stack of potential problems. First, you have just plain old storage medium failure. And most digital storage uses some kind of encoding or compression. Mm-hmm. So that means that when you have one bit failure, you have just one single bit that fails in your digital recording, it can affect potentially a much larger portion of your data, because the way that these encoding and compression mechanisms work is that they take a chunk of data and they do some processing on it, and you end up with the encoded or compressed chunk of data, which takes less room but has less redundancy in it. So that's the first step. So you lose a bit, you lose potentially a large chunk of data, and it's really, really difficult to recover. And what's interesting, by the way, is that pretty much all digital recording that's used professionally since the beginning of time has error correction built in it, which is kind of this underlying assumption that, hey, something could go wrong. And they already, based on that, we have at IMES, we have some of the very last few working 3M digital recorders. These are quite rare. and they have error correction in them. And it's interesting that, it's 1979, it was already established that you need to have that built in to be able to have somewhat reliable storage. So on top of that, once you read your raw content, well, you have the whole stack of potential obsolescence. You have format obsolescence, you have the software obsolescence, and you have potentially operating system dependencies obsolescence. So you have, and it can affect content that is even relatively recent. So for example, if you have a Pro Tools session from 1996, recorded, backed up using retrospect on an old macOS machine, you're in trouble today. So we've had to deal with that and essentially had to reconstruct the old stack to be able to read that. So, and this is, we're talking 20 years, maybe 30 years. It's recent. It's not, from an archiving, from a preservation standpoint, this isn't the blink of an eye, essentially. So there's quite a bit of challenges with that. On top of that, what's interesting is that a lot of the current digital storage technologies have, as you mentioned, a strong corporate linkage. They are semi-proprietary. They're put together by a certain corporation, and the typical lifetime, the typical life expectancy of a corporation is about 20 years or something like that. So that also is not entirely confidence inspiring when you're thinking about long-term preservation. So that can definitely be a bit of an issue. You're entering into a partnership with an entity, and you're tying your destiny, the destiny of your content, to that entity's life expectancy. So that's a risk that needs to be managed also.
Indeed, and we saw recently the world is, deeply shocked that the iPod is being discontinued by Apple. Right. Of course, that the Fraunhofer, if I have this right, they discontinued kind of support for the MP3 format back in 2017. Right. I'm not sure what's happening with that now. So, like you say, these lossy formats, you kind of need the keys, the error correction keys, to actually unpack this stuff. And I remember using Retrospect for a Mac back in the day, and I haven't even thought about, how I would back up from those kind of backups. I'm sure I have some DVDs with those kind of backups on them, but obviously no way to open them now. So this is really interesting. I'm sure you possibly came across this. The NYT columnist and best-selling author Thomas L. Friedman wrote a really interesting book called Thank You for Being Late, and it was all about the digital revolution. And he highlighted the curious fact that many of the main driving forces in this revolution that we think has been around for a long time, they basically landed around 2007, and cloud computing was definitely one of these, probably one of the strongest. Now, it's been around for a good amount of time, and it's completely ubiquitous now. We use the cloud for everything, for backups, for virtual instruments, for, everything, absolutely everything. So nobody doubts the cloud is here to stay, but really the question is, why hasn't the cloud become a strong option or the option for archiving and long-term preservation? Why is that kind of penny not dropped quite yet with most people?
This is probably a $1 billion question, quite literally.
Yeah, right.
The cloud definitely has tremendous potential for archiving. Yeah. In the sense that it does have some, at least it has excellent claims to durability, and also the fact that you can structure your data in a way that you can do geographic separation. You can have as many duplicates as you want. You can really structure you can structure among different classes of storage, from things you want to access very fast to just deep dark storage. So there is definitely potential for archival. And on top of that, you can build an application stack on top of that. And you can also use emulation to go into to fight essentially software and format obsolescence. So the potential is there. The thing, though, is that first, it has evolved a lot over the past 15 years since that since it became a thing, and the cloud of today is so vastly different from what it was back then. And this is a good thing, of course, because we have many more capabilities. But this is something that that the preservation community is eyeing with a bit of concern because features are added, features are removed, and they prefer stability. They prefer some features to be there forever. So, and also the cloud has been around for a while now. It's here to stay, but it's also like saying that cars are here to stay, but not necessarily that a certain brand is here to stay. So Duesenberg is not around, even though they're pretty nice cars, and so we go again into the fact that most of the cloud providers are corporations, and they make their own decisions as to where to go and whether they're bought or not, and that is a challenge because once again you're tying the destiny of your content to an entity which makes its own decisions. So it's a can be a dicey proposition. So we actually spent quite a bit of time. I co-chaired a working group last year with some of the Hollywood studios discussing that. And that gathered preservationists from the studios as well as cloud providers. And this was a very interesting discussion indeed, grappling with these issues.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine, in terms of the assets that Hollywood produces, for starters, those, I don't know, what's above it, those kind of terabytes and terabytes of data, video, and audio, production material, and like we were saying, this is like the cultural catalogue of humanity since we've been able to record stuff. I'm agreeing strongly with all of the stuff you're saying here, and I'm very glad you're involved in the working groups as well. But talk to us a bit about, as mentioned in the introduction, you co-authored this fantastic paper, and it was published with the Archive Working Group of the Entertainment Technology Center at University of Southern California. And you were talking about how to use the cloud more effectively as a potential option for digital preservation. I wonder, would it be possible just to have a look into some of the findings there? Could you take us through some of the thoughts that you were sharing in the white paper?
Sure. I'm going to share the screen here for a bit.
Great. Yeah, okay. I might step back from the stage to hand it over to the slides here.
Okay.
All good. Looking good. Thank you.
Very good. So this was indeed, I had the pleasure of co-chairing this archive working group with, it basically gathered a number of the main preservation groups from the main Hollywood studios, as well as cloud providers and other parties who are deeply interested in the conundrum of archiving and preservation. And the premise was basically this: you're an archivist who is working for a large studio who has the entire cultural and work history of the studio, and you have this classic solution right now that is on-prem and tape-based, and you see everyone in production having a great time using the cloud, which is something that's happening more and more in post-production, and you're wondering whether the cloud would potentially be a solution, or somebody at the executive level tells you should really look into this cloud thing. We heard that it's great. We heard that it could potentially save us money, which is always a concern at the studio management level, because you have to constantly upgrade your on-prem solution. So could you look into the potential of introducing the cloud as potential storage? But don't lose a single bit, otherwise it's your career. So this can be, of course, a little bit stressful. So what we discussed was how to introduce that with proper risk management. Go slow, maybe introduce the cloud as a first layer of storage, and then go deeper. What would it take to actually have everything in the cloud, all the storage in the cloud, or the complete stack in the cloud? So this led to very, very interesting discussions. There's great benefits to that. First off, infrastructure. You don't have to constantly renew your infrastructure, which is always a problem, of course, when you're thinking about on-prem deployments, because you're once again thinking for the long term. It's not infrastructure that you set up for the project. You need to constantly update it. Alignment is also better as production moves more and more into cloud, as you can move your production directly in the cloud without having to extract it somehow and format it for an on-prem storage. Scale is a good, also something that where the cloud can contribute very positively, because the cloud is all about scale. Actually, the cloud is, the reason why everybody in production is so interested in the cloud is that you have a new production, you can spin up all the machines you want and use them only for your production, and then you spin everything down. The same goes when you have something to ingest into an archive, you do the same thing, as well as in terms of storage, you have a big production that comes in, well, you can instantly ingest that. You can instantly allocate the storage that you need to ingest your content. There is no need to think about it at the beginning of the year when it's time to do your infrastructure refresh. So, and as we talked about before, you can structure your storage exactly as you want, both in terms of accessibility and redundancy, and which helps with accessibility. And also, finally, the cloud storage is always near cloud computing resources. And that means that you always have the possibility to call upon cloud computing to reprocess your data, which is actually important to keep your data current. We'll talk about this a little bit later. What's interesting is that the studios have had their history of pain when it comes to new technologies and archives. So that led to some very interesting discussion. The thing to think about is that the production portion of an asset is a relatively short amount of time compared to the preservation stage. You know, you prepare your asset, you create your asset, you do various amount of post-processing, and then you have a deliverable, and you send it to archival. Well, that was about 6 months to 2 years, you know, and then you're done, right? That's it. It goes in, it goes on the shelf, and it's good to go. Well, no, which it's good that it's not, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have a job. That's what I spend my life doing. Is the preservation is a very active portion of the life cycle of an asset. You have to make sure it's accessible, it's readable, it's current, because it's going to be used time and again at moments that you can't really predict for various potential uses. So, I mean, you know, to take an example coming from the movie industry, you have, for example, a shot of young Luke Skywalker that you know, from the late 70s, and maybe you want to use it to youngify an older Luke Skywalker in something that is shot today. Heaven knows that, you know, that probably somebody did that. And, or you can make a director's cut, or you can prepare it for another streaming service. So there is tremendous use in the long tail that we don't even know about. I mean, I'm sure Buster Keaton wasn't thinking about YouTube, for example. So, the issue with the archivists, the preservation communities, that they've had their share of disappointments with technology. Everything fails. Everything eventually fails, and you know, paper disintegrates or gets eaten. Film gets vinegar syndrome. Magnetic tape gets mold. Binder hydrolysis, sticky shed. So many potential issues. Everything that is CDs and DVDs has interesting issues of degradation of the layer where the recording is. Hard drives crash, so they're thinking, what about the cloud? Well, we don't really know, and they want to know, you know, and this is actually what the discussion was about, is how does the cloud fail? So what's interesting to know is that the preservation community knows that storage mediums will fail, and they've designed a methodology to get around that, to actually manage that, to risk manage. And it's really pretty simple. First, you characterize your storage medium. How does it fail? And how long will it take for it to start failing? And then you design a methodology to check your media periodically, well within the range of failure, to be able to catch any potential problems, and you have a strategy of duplication. You make several copies so that when one of the copies fail, you can reestablish proper duplication. And that's the way that, for example, tape archives are managed. And for digital content, this is the way this happens. The asset gets ingested, a checksum gets prepared of the content of the asset as soon as it's ingested. So that gives you a signature of what a known good asset looks like. And periodically, the archived assets get retrieved and the checksum gets calculated and compared against the known good signature. And if that doesn't match, that means there's a problem and we need to, this is a bad copy that needs to be replaced. This is called the fixity cycle. And we spent a lot of time in the working group discussing this because it's an essential instrument of durability in the cloud. Sorry about that. The fixity cycle first checks whether your assets is intact. It drives the proper replication. So you know when you have a failure, you know when to replace it. It also helps with determining media aging and when your media is getting close to migration time in bulk. You know, if you all of a sudden have LTO5 stored content fail in increasing amounts, you know, it's time to really seriously think about migrating all of your LTO5s. And also, this is something that some insurance companies may require as a guarantee of the content integrity. Because let's not forget that there is just a lot of value in this content. So we actually asked a number of studios, major studios, what their needs were as it comes to fixity and content verification, and they all wanted fixity in some way or other. There was some variability in how long, but it's usually quarterly to every year. So based on what we know about LTO tape, and so there is some variation, but there were also a lot of common ground. What's interesting is that you'll read that LTO tape is meant to last 30 years, but that's the ideal number. You write it once, you put it on a shelf in absolutely ideal condition, and this is the maximum time that you can expect it to last. In practice, it's much less than that. It's typically been found to be a few years. It's both a consequence of the fact that tapes are never written in a way that's ideal, and also the fact that, well, drives age a whole lot faster than tapes too. So LTO1 drives are not that old, but they're hard to find, and they're definitely not always in optimal working condition. So now when it comes to cloud, we introduced the cloud vendors, and the cloud vendors are in a bit of a pickle there. The problem is, sorry about that. There is not quite enough known in terms of characterization about cloud in terms of durability. The cloud vendors, of course, have some data integrity mechanisms in their architecture, but they can't really reveal that much about it without revealing a lot about the business model, and that's an issue. Sorry about that, I have a bit of a cold, so. So what we came to in terms of conclusion is that there is definitely a need for fixity services in the cloud, at least for a while, or an integrity mechanism that can lead straight to fixity in terms of equivalence. This is actually something we spent a lot of time on, discussing optimization of fixity verification in the cloud. The first discussion we had was about tying cloud integrity mechanisms to the fixity process. And this came out to be actually quite difficult. Here I give you an example. For example, this is a complicated slide, but the problem is that the cloud, of course, does data integrity verification and uses redundancy as a way to, data duplication as a way to actually have durability. But the way that data integrity is verified is done at a much lower level than the fixity process, which is file by file. And using cloud verification mechanism to obtain a fixity result takes about as much in terms of computational resources as actually doing fixity calculation from scratch. So unfortunately, we found that in the current cloud storage implementations, it wasn't really possible to practically use cloud integrity verification processes as a way to obtain fixity results. So call to action to the cloud vendors, because nothing is impossible, to potentially provide a archival grade file system that would do that automatically, or provide optimization for fixity calculations in terms of computational load and costs, really. And actually, some cloud vendors are actively looking into that. There is something called serverless hashing, which is just serverless services are services that have a small footprint in terms of execution and in terms of memory and time spent computing. And therefore, they can be used as filler processes. And so they're quite inexpensive. So that's a possibility. So you're archivist, you want to go to, you want to introduce the cloud. What do? Well, first you'll actually definitely use fixity. You need to use fixity. And you'll need to probably do so in a way that can gather information on your cloud storage solution and compare it to what you know about tape, for example, to what you know about your classic implementation. So this is probably going to be a hybrid implementation that will be able to gather comparative information, apples to apples information between traditional archive storage and the cloud. And you'll be able to use these reports to characterize how you're going to do fixity on the cloud on an ongoing basis. So the easiest way to do that, for starters, is to actually have one of your copies be in the cloud, in the 3-copy scenario. So you retain your on-prem archive, and you add a cloud copy. You have one of the copies be in the cloud, and you can experiment with that. And the best way to do that actually is a virtual tape library, which allows for a little bit of cloud storage to look exactly like a tape. So you have a device that's in front of your tape library that does the abstraction for you. So this is actually a great platform for experiment. And you use your application exactly as is, and you have essentially a little bit of cloud, but your application doesn't really know. And it adds some architectural complexity, and it makes it more difficult to use cloud features like serverless hashing, because you essentially abstract your storage into a blob on the cloud, but it gets you started for basic durability studies. And this is actually where we discuss the concept of a longitudinal study. The problem with studying durability on an archival medium is that, much like the archival thinking, it takes time, time that people don't necessarily always think about having. So, but this is what's needed in order to gather information on the cloud in terms of durability, is to take the time, at least 2 tape generations, so about 5 years or so. So, by using the virtual tape library architecture, you could do that. You could actually have the same archive in the cloud and in an on-prem configuration. And through fixity, calculations determine if and when it fails on the cloud, and be able to determine your strategy for verification in the cloud So because the interesting thing is that if the cloud is more reliable than tape, which the cloud vendors claim it is, then you will not have to verify it every year like you do with tape. You'll be able to have your interval be much longer, and therefore that reduces your costs. So, but you need to know in order to be able to do that. It's important to actually properly characterize the storage. So once you have that, that's when you can start actually being bolder with things and say, okay, well, now I'm going to actually do on-prem directly cloud native storage again. So this is where you can actually have your assets come from production in the cloud and go directly as objects in the cloud. And probably still prudent to keep a hybrid approach there. So you still have your safety factor. This is the most complex approach probably. But this is, remember, we're still risk managing here. So, well, once you have characterized your cloud, this is where you can develop the fixity services in the cloud there and be able to put new policies in place. And that requires, this is where actually there will be much thinking needed in terms of packaging, because as a storage architecture, the cloud is definitely different than on-prem. So this is where we get into discussions about packaging, about metadata organization, and about really taking advantage of cloud features to organize your archive properly. And this probably will be the object of continuing efforts from future working groups, but also this is something we actually think about very seriously at IMES. So I mentioned here a couple of papers that are both from DTC and Archivists on the topic. But this allows you to structure your archive storage, as we mentioned, take advantage of cloud native features to properly structure your archive for accessibility, and also be able to run more of the infrastructure, introduce more of the infrastructure into the cloud, which is actually important not only for the purpose of running fixity, but also keeping your archive current. There's been an evolution of search since the 1990s, where at the beginning you had this advanced search with 25 options that you need to carefully aim your search gun at a specific thing. Then Google came around and you had just a single search field that you entered and you got plenty of results and you used your brain to actually select the right one. And now with Alexa and Siri and most of the modern search approaches, you're having this sort of dialogue with your search space that goes with very different metadata in the background. So that means you need to reprocess data to actually keep that current. And who knows what will happen in the future when it comes to that. And by the same token, going back to the Luke Skywalker shot, you need to be able to better find, nobody could have imagined 40 years ago that you need to be able to find the various angles, for example, of the character. This is something that was not part of the metadata back then, and it would need to be kept current. So being able to use cloud computing to constantly reprocess the data to make it usable is very important in that context. And this is something where this infrastructure, this type of architecture organization of the archive would allow it to keep current. Then you go to this sort of final step, which is the multi-cloud archive, which gets around what we talked about, which is the fact that corporations make their own decisions that may not be necessarily aligned with the content owner's direction. So there has to be a degree of vendor independence. And the way to do that is to actually not rely on a single vendor, of course. And you can have, what's interesting there is that we can imagine an archive of the future that uses the cloud, but that also has an on-prem component that uses the same cloud storage organization, so object storage on-prem. So you essentially reverse the premise of your archive storage structure and do everything in a cloud manner, which provides you with the proper amount of control of your own destiny, so to speak. So in conclusion, there's definite potential in the cloud for archive, for a future in the archive, for archiving application. But it needs to be characterized. That's something that all the preservationists insisted on. And that work needs to be done, potentially using hybrid architecture. And there's quite a bit of work to be done, and it's something actually we're working on at IMES. So we're thinking about that very much. So that was the presentation.
Wonderful. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Denis. You know, you really said a few things that chimed very strongly with me. Number one, I wish there was an app to send you a virtual Irish coffee. I don't know if that would be...
Oh, sorry about that.
And no problem. No problem at all. This is what Irish coffees are for. I mean, they don't necessarily take away the problem, but they kind of reduce they reduce how much you think about it. But that was absolutely perfect. You know, that was really super interesting. You know, the three bombshell words that really resonated there was everything eventually fails. Wow, that's the TLDR. It also sounds like the missing Samuel Beckett and Ingmar Bergman collaboration that the world needs today. But everything eventually fails. Oh my goodness, you know, this is what you need to have in mind when you're thinking about archiving and storage. And I used to work for a bunch of tech companies, and you know, one of the big takeaways, the big unlocks of living in this this world of digitization is you need a multi-vendor strategy for any kind of you know, for any kind of technology, you know, strategy. Basically, you need multiple vendors, because what happens, as we've seen with, you know, the kind of world of crypto recently, is that, you know, some companies are very volatile, some spaces are very volatile, some technologies, as you said, just disappear because, you know, they're commercial entities and people stop buying them and they move on to the other thing. So when it comes to storage, you really need to have, exactly as you are saying, that long-term strategy and that long-term focus. And I was just thinking of my own enormous collection of digital music as a big music lover and you know, occasional DJ. I have that on 2 hard drives, and I really do need to put it in the cloud as well. That's sort of been on my to-do list forever. But having watched this presentation, it's just moved up my to-do list to something I'm going to do this weekend. So thank you very much to that. We had a great comment in our dedicated Discord channel on the Discord server, the convention Discord server, folks, that is going to be around until the end of July. And that comment was just fantastic. It really resonated with me. From Ven I, thank you again for your contribution, Ven. And this comment was, speaking of digital storage, one of my hard drives containing projects from 2017 to 2018 failed, and I don't have the data elsewhere. And I recalled a saying my professor used to tell us often: there are 2 types of hard drives, those that have already failed and those that will fail. So, oh my goodness. And, you know, I kid you not, I have 2 MacBook Pros from back like 2012, 2013, and both of them have failed. The hard drives are just, you know, honestly, I did have them backed up, but it's still a shock when it happens. So we are now going to open it up for Q&A. Now, that was a very thorough presentation, so it is quite possible that you've answered all of our delegates' questions, but I actually have a few that I wouldn't mind running by you now. So, you know, one kind of assumes that backing up your files to Dropbox is fine, and then you can forget about it. Is that right?
No.
Okay. I'm glad I was able to ask you that directly. Right? Why is that not right?
I mean, it's first, you're tying yourself to a single vendor, and we've had file sharing services that have just gone poof, and people where, you know, where are my files? This has happened before. Nothing can say that this won't happen again, and you just are essentially trusting Dropbox. Without many guarantees. So, you know, if you want to put them there and your time is short, like your timeline is short, that's fine, you know. But if you are thinking about it from a long-term standpoint, that is a dicey proposition. Because you are just basically you're having unmanaged risk that you're not really aware of. So that's a bit of an issue. We use Dropbox occasionally for file transfers. For that, it's perfect. You know, it's because it lives on Dropbox for a short period of time and it's accessible. But as an archive solution, it's not just sufficient. So,
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. I use a number of those kind of temporary cloud transfer services. They're fantastic for sending, podcast edits and all that kind of thing. But yeah, would I trust it with my music collection? I don't know. I mean, I did have. I'm getting into too much personal information, but I have had my music collection backed up on 2 external hard drives, and one of them failed. And oh my goodness, it was like, you just, if the other one failed, that's it. They're all gone.
Right.
What a thought. I mean, yes.
To go back to hard drives, actually, it's really important to keep in mind that the primary mode of existence of a hard drive is to be on, spinning, and warmed up for maybe 5 years, probably less.
Yeah.
It really needs to be looked at as a rather impermanent way of storage. It's really a working medium. So so definitely tape is better than that, because tape is meant to be removed and stored on a shelf. Hard drives are not, and it is actually distressing that I've done that too. I put stuff on a hard drive and I forget about it. I don't use that for archive, but I just forget about it, and then the hard drive doesn't start. They're really not meant to be sitting. They don't take well to that. So yes, definitely. I know that there's a lot of content out there that is stored on hard drive. I know that because I've seen it, and there's always a closet full of hard drives in anybody's home or some corporations, and this is something to be concerned about, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I've got a old record box that I used to carry around, 12-inch vinyl, and that's now just full of hard drives, and I can't even remember what's on them. And I don't know how many of them would start up now, but we've actually had a great question come in now, and this is something I would love to know the answer to myself. So this is from Ven Ivanov. So thank you very much for that question, Ven. And the question is, many people say that SSDs are better than spinning hard drives for archiving. So that's the solid state drives. Is that true? What say you, Denis?
They are better in the sense that they are more reliable from the standpoint of shock and that sort of thing. Okay. But I haven't really seen any data on the characterization and their failure modes. I mean, the physics of it is not super confidence inspiring either. So they may be better in the sense that they don't have any mechanical parts, but they also would need to be properly characterized from a durability standpoint. So the jury is kind of still out on those. I mean, I've seen SSDs fail too. And they're also designed to be used powered up also. It's really, I haven't really seen any consequences of leaving a SSD by itself for a long period of time.
Yeah, indeed. So like, the external hard drives are very much consumables. They're designed to be used and powered up, and just leaving them on the shelf, as I have done, as I've got a box full of hard drives. It's maybe not the best thing. So you mentioned that tape is a good solution, but you also mentioned that LTO tape maybe isn't such a long-term solution. You kind of touched on that in your presentation. Could you kind of just refresh my memory about LTO tape and where that kind of stands?
So with tape, it's complicated. What's interesting is that tape actually is designed to be removed from the tape drive and stored on a shelf. Yeah. So definitely that gives it potential for archiving. However, if you make a single copy on a single LTO tape and put it on a shelf, that is really not proper practice, because tape also has its own failure modes that are fairly well known, and it'll only last a certain amount of time. So it probably is the medium that was the most intended for archiving. But even LTO tapes guarantees top out at 30 years, which is really not that long. And in practice, they're quite a bit shorter than that. So the best way to use LTO tape is as part of an archival strategy. You make several copies, and they get verified periodically, and you make sure that you have the right number of copies remaining. That's basically the proper strategy of using tapes. And there's enough known about tape to know that if you verify them every year or so, you can maintain that indefinitely. But you need to migrate. So the problem with tape is that it's actually more on the side of the drives actually than the tapes, because the drives keep evolving and you can't really find a brand new, LTO1 drive anymore. And there's plenty of LTO1 tapes and they're not 30 years old, but yet they're difficult to read just because of the drive. This is another one of these features where there certainly was time put and work put into making sure the technology kept up, and had durability for the tape, but not quite the same amount of effort into the drive. And you can't read the tape without the drive. So that means you need to probably migrate the tape at a faster rate than any of its promises, like typically 2 generations, 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. This is amazing advice. And we have a comment from our online convention chair, Raphael Cassier. Thank you for this comment. Very, very relatable. He says, ever feel like the sermon is meant for you? Feeling very uncomfortable right now. And strong agree there, Raph. Absolutely. I'm thinking about all those hard drives and all those music files and all those project files. I mean, a lot of the folks watching, like Raf, like myself, like, many, many people involved in AS, they're creating, kind of audio work. They're creating surround mixes. They're creating AV stuff. What would your top advice be for, all the folks feeling a bit worried right now? The creators, and they're thinking about their archives and, oh my goodness, what do we do now? Because the hard drive it's a consumable. It's probably going to fall over. The cloud services, they may be around. The hardware is an issue for playing back tapes. What's your kind of best advice for all of us feeling worried now?
It's important to think about the future, definitely, when creating, which is difficult because, when you're in this quitting mindset, you just want to go for it and to move on. So the best thing you can do is, of course, have several copies and check them once in a while. Think about the work you did 3 years ago. Does that drive still spin up? Spinning up a drive prolongs its life. If it's on tape, it's even better. Probably a good idea to reread that. And also, standards matter. Saving a Pro Tools session today and hoping to be able to read it in 10 years, not really sure, like migration. So, if you have anything that you can save in any kind of like de facto standards, avail yourself to that. It will make your work more usable. I mean, plain old WAV file, is really one of those things that has legs, even though it's not really a standard. It's just, it's some format by some company, but it has some legs. So. It's a good idea to keep things at the lowest, sort of lowest common denominator of data that everybody can read and everybody can use. That gives your work longevity. So I know it's difficult, but it's essentially preparing your work for your successor or your children, and who are going to access it when they're adults, right? Like that gets you into that long-term thinking.
Yeah, totally. And you just reminded me of a chat I had with a wonderful, 7 times Grammy winner when we spoke, producer, engineer, Frank Filippetti. And, he's not a fan of the cloud music services because he's like, how could I, what happens if one of the cloud music services goes down? So he likes to have stuff on, physical media, CDs. He likes to have the digital audio files. So he will always have access to them. But you've just kind of opened a can of worms there. What about your music collection? Maybe you have it on MP3 or AAC or, FLAC or whatever it is, and you want to pass it down to your children. I mean, would you kind of have some advice there about your kind of media collection, if you like? And of course, we're thinking about photographs as well. So much, we used to have photo albums when I was a kid. Now it's, it's hard drives, it's, iPhoto or whatever it is. Are there any kind of words of advice you'd have for folks who are looking at this from a family point of view. Like they want to preserve their photographs, their music library. They want to hand it on to future generations.
It's always good to look at it from the standpoint of accessibility.
Yeah.
So if you have, I do that. So, and I try to prepare my media in a format that either has a lot of adoption, meaning there's many ways to read it. There's many ways to read it. Irish coffee would be so handy right now.
Irish coffee and pressing the button.
Right. So, or that, the tools are commonly used. So it's really that it can be consumed easily, in terms of accessibility. So it's a matter of, once again, we go back to standards, like if it's actually a commonly adopted standard or a commonly adopted format, that means it'll have legs in the future, and then my children will have a chance to look at it, and making as many copies as possible, potentially keeping some on-prem, the really precious stuff, keeping some copies locally with me. It's just basically preserving accessibility over time, which is easier said than done.
Yeah, indeed. So that's fantastic. I kind of asked you from quite a personal / selfish point of view there for some advice while I have you on the call. But for any of the folks who are watching, maybe they're from kind of larger companies. You mentioned you work with Hollywood there. If they're thinking, okay, this is kind of ringing an emergency bell in my head. I know the board of directors is going to be, grabbing me by the lapels next week and saying, okay, what are we doing about cloud storage? Where can they find out more information about IMES?
They can find information at www.imes.media.
Perfect.
And of course, you can always reach out to me. We're always happy to help. Definitely, this is something we think about every day. That's our daily bread. Yeah.
For sure. Okay, brilliant. Well, listen, Denis, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time, with your advice. I have some immediate action points for the weekend. I think Raphael Cassier does as well. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are very grateful for your time, for your work that you're doing in this field, and for really helping us not kind of make a terrible mistake. That old Mike Tyson saying, everyone has a plan until you get a thump in the face, or something along those lines. But, everyone has a plan until your hard drive just doesn't exist anymore and you have a blank screen on your laptop. So yeah, this is sage advice. I think it's probably a good time for everyone to be thinking about cloud backup. Thank you very much, Vice President of Technology at IMES, Denis Leconte. Thank you.